The first thing the watchers of Keth Prime noticed about the human ship was that it did not ask permission to exist. It did not broadcast lineage codes or trade intents or ritualized warnings of mass and velocity. It arrived at the edge of the system like a thought that had already been decided, coasting in on momentum that spoke of distances too large to bother counting. The watchers, whose bodies were lattices of crystal and fluid nerve, felt the disturbance ripple through their observation arrays and compared it against everything they knew. The comparison did not resolve into anything familiar, and so the watchers did what they had always done when confronted with the unfamiliar. They measured. Keth Prime circled a dim orange star, its orbit layered with stations, temples, archives, and the slow, deliberate traffic of a civilization that had never needed to hurry. The Watchers had been installed in the earliest era of interstellar expansion, their role to observe incoming phenomena and announce threats with sufficient time for consensus to form. Consensus was the Keth way. No decision mattered until it had been touched by every facet of their society and turned until all angles were known. War was therefore rare, and annihilation even rarer, because annihilation did not permit discussion afterward. The human ship did not care about consensus. It slid past the system's outer markers and began braking with an efficiency that made the Watchers pause their calculations to verify their own instruments. Its hull geometry was inelegant by Keth standards, a blunt convergence of plates and protrusions, as if designed by creatures more concerned with surviving impact than pleasing an eye that saw spectra beyond color. Its drive signature suggested layered redundancies and tolerances for error that bordered on the wasteful. The Watchers recorded all of this and found themselves, for the first time in several millennia, unable to extrapolate intent. Within the ship, a human named Taek Solman stood on the command deck and watched the star swell in the forward displays. He had been born on a habitat that spun around nothing at all, a ring of metal and soil that pretended gravity out of habit, and he had learned early that systems did not care about expectations. They did what physics allowed and no more. He trusted that lesson more than any doctrine. The ship was called Resolute of Clay, a name chosen by a committee that had argued for 3 weeks and compromised by picking something everyone disliked equally. Taek liked it anyway. Clay was what you shaped. Resolute was what you had to be when the shaping went wrong. The mission briefing had been clear in its lack of clarity. The Keth Compact had issued a system-wide notice declaring a boundary that humanity had crossed without knowing it existed. The notice included a demand for explanation, an apology, and a period of isolation while the Compact debated appropriate response. Humanity had responded by dispatching Resolute of Clay with a single instruction: find out what they actually want. The ship carried no diplomats in the traditional sense, because humanity had learned that diplomats trained only in ceremony tended to fail when the other side did not share the same ceremonies. Instead, it carried engineers, historians, biologists, and people like Taek who had a talent for listening without assuming. As the ship slowed, the internal gravity shifted subtly and Taek adjusted his stance without thinking. Around him, the command crew worked with quiet focus. Their interfaces were physical and tactile, built for hands that liked to feel resistance. No one spoke unless necessary. There was a superstition among spacer crews that talking too much in a foreign system invited trouble, and while no one admitted to believing it, no one challenged it either. The first message from the Watchers arrived not as sound or image, but as a mathematical structure, a lattice of primes and ratios that defined space, time, and the expectation of reply. The ship's translation core unfolded it carefully, mapping it against known communication frameworks. Taek watched the process with a faint smile. Humanity had learned long ago that the universe was full of minds that thought math was the most polite way to knock. When the reply went out, it was equally careful. It acknowledged receipt, mirrored the mathematical courtesy and added a layer of information about human biology, cognition, and social variance. It did not apologize yet. Tayek had insisted on that. Apologies meant different things to different species, and offering one before understanding the grievance was a good way to make things worse. The Watchers absorbed the reply and added it to their deliberation matrices. They noted the absence of apology. This was unusual. Most species, upon realizing they had crossed an unseen boundary, rushed to express regret. The Watchers recorded this as a data point, neither positive nor negative, simply distinct. They extended a request for the human vessel to enter a designated orbit and remain there while a physical envoy was prepared. The envoy took the form of a Keth individual named Hrevan Thrice-Faceted, whose body was a slow choreography of shifting planes and luminous veins. Hrevan had volunteered for the role, which meant that Hrevan had convinced a sufficient number of peers that direct contact would be instructive rather than dangerous. As Hrevan's transport detached from the station and glided toward the human ship, the Watchers adjusted their attention, allocating additional processing to monitor the interaction. It had been a long time since anything genuinely new had arrived. The docking interface was a compromise of geometry and force fields that took hours to negotiate. The human ship extended a modular chamber that could be reconfigured for different atmospheric and pressure requirements, while the Keth transport projected a containment field tuned to its own needs. When the systems finally synchronized, Hrevan flowed into the chamber, light refracting through facets that shifted with internal thought. Tayek entered the chamber alone, wearing a simple pressure suit with the helmet retracted. He raised his hands slowly, palms visible, a gesture that humanity had found to be broadly understandable even when it meant nothing specific. The translation core rendered Hrevan's opening statement into auditory and visual overlays, but Tayek focused on the patterns of light, trusting his instincts as much as the software. You have crossed a line drawn before your species learned to draw lines between stars, Hrevan conveyed. Explain the necessity. Tayek considered the phrasing. Necessity was a strong word. We did not know the line existed, he said. Our expansion follows resource gradients and habitable zones. We do not map boundaries unless someone shows them to us. Hrevan's facets shifted, a motion the translation core flagged as contemplation. Ignorance does not erase consequence. No, Tayek agreed, but it changes intent. We did not come to challenge your compact. We came because the equations said we could. The Watchers noted the phrase equations said we could and flagged it for later analysis. Many species expanded according to doctrine, prophecy, or fear. Expansion by equation suggested a relationship with reality that prioritized testable outcomes over inherited meaning. Hrevan responded with a projection of the compact's history, a slow unfurling of time in which borders were established after wars that had nearly unmade several member civilizations. The line humanity had crossed was not arbitrary. It was a scar, invisible but carefully tended. We do not wish to repeat these outcomes, Hrevan said. Your presence risks reopening old patterns. Tayek listened, and something in his expression softened. We understand scars, he said. Our history is nothing but layers of them, but we learned something painful and useful. Scars do not disappear because you refuse to touch them. They fade because the tissue beneath them changes. Hrevan's light pulsed in a rhythm that suggested discomfort. You propose change as a solution to risk. I propose adaptation, Tayek said. There is a difference. Change can be blind. Adaptation is measured. The conversation continued for hours, looping through concepts of sovereignty, exploration, and responsibility. At no point did Tayek threaten or promise anything beyond what he knew humanity could deliver. He spoke of colonies that failed and were abandoned, of habitats that tore themselves apart because someone had misjudged a stress tolerance. He spoke of children born under artificial skies who learned to love the stars not as symbols but as destinations. Revan absorbed it all, facets recording light and nuance. When the envoy returned to Keth Prime, the Watchers convened a broader consensus. They replayed the interaction, slowed it down, overlaid it with historical parallels. Humanity did not fit cleanly into any category the compact recognized. They were not conquerors in the classic sense, but neither were they pilgrims seeking a promised ideal. They were disturbingly practical. The debate stretched across cycles. Some argued for immediate exclusion, citing the danger of a species that expanded without regard for inherited boundaries. Others pointed out that such expansion had already occurred and that forceful exclusion might provoke the very conflict the compact sought to avoid. A smaller faction, often overlooked, suggested something unprecedented: collaboration. While the Keth debated, Tayek received updates from Sol, from the scattered worlds and stations that made up humanity's reach. He watched messages from people he would never meet, describing lives built on marginal worlds, on asteroids spun into gardens, on ships that never landed anywhere permanent. Humanity had learned to live in between, to make homes out of transience. That skill had cost them dearly, but it had also taught them resilience that no single planet could provide. The Watchers finally transmitted a provisional decision. Humanity would be permitted to maintain a presence in the system under observation, on the condition that they share their navigational models and expansion algorithms with the Compact. In return, the Compact would open portions of its own historical archives, including records of the wars that had shaped its borders. It was an exchange of vulnerability, and everyone involved understood the risk. Tayek read the message twice, then allowed himself a slow breath. This was more than he had hoped for. It was also more dangerous. Shared models meant shared assumptions, and assumptions were where misunderstandings bred. He composed a reply that accepted the terms and added a clause of his own, that human representatives be allowed to witness the Compact's consensus process, not as participants, but as observers. Revan delivered the response in person, facets bright, with something the translation corps hesitated to define. "You wish to watch us decide," Revan said. "Why? Because decisions shape outcomes," Tayek said, "and outcomes shape equations. If we are to share models, we need to understand the variables you consider important." The Watchers considered this request and found no precedent to apply. Eventually, consensus formed around cautious approval. Observation was not influence, they reasoned. And perhaps being seen in the act of deciding would reinforce the gravity of their boundaries. As arrangements were made, Tayek stood once more on the command deck and looked out at Keth Prime. The planet glowed with layered light, cities grown like reefs over ancient foundations. He felt the familiar tension between optimism and dread that accompanied every first contact. Humanity had a habit of surviving encounters that should have destroyed them, but survival was not the same as wisdom. This time, he hoped, they might manage both. In the deep layers of the Compact archives, as access protocols prepared to open, old records stirred. They contained accounts of species that had come with confidence and been broken, of others that had come with humility and been absorbed. None had come quite like humanity, with their equations and their scars worn openly. The Watchers, for the first time since their installation, adjusted their predictive models to include a new parameter that did not reduce easily to numbers. They labeled it stubborn adaptability and marked it as both a threat and a promise. Far from Keth Prime, beyond the edge of the system where Resolute of Clay had first emerged, other human ships continued their quiet expansion. They followed gradients and equations, unaware that their presence had already begun to bend the expectations of an ancient Compact. The universe, vast and indifferent, made room as it always did. What filled that room would depend on how well its newest inhabitants understood the measure of unbroken things. Observation began not with spectacle, but with waiting. The Keth consensus chambers were not places designed to impress outsiders. They were distributed volumes embedded throughout Keth Prime's crust and orbital structures, connected by streams of data and ritualized delay. Decisions were not made in rooms so much as grown across time, like crystals accreting layer by layer. For a species that experienced thought as a blend of light, pressure, and harmonic resonance, haste was synonymous with error. Taek Solman was escorted into the first chamber he was permitted to observe, a cavernous space whose walls were semi-translucent and alive with slow-moving patterns. He was not required to wear a suit here. The atmosphere had been adjusted carefully, molecule by molecule, to accommodate his biology without discomfort. That accommodation itself was a statement. The compact did not alter itself lightly. He stood on a platform grown from the same substance as the walls, his boots sinking a fraction of a centimeter before stabilizing. There were no seats, no focal point. Instead, Keth individuals drifted in and out of the chamber's volume, their faceted bodies intersecting beams of light that carried data, memory, and argument. Taek's translation implants worked constantly, filtering sensation into something he could process, but even so he felt like a child standing inside a machine too large to see all at once. Revan, thrice faceted, was present, distinguishable by a recurring triadic pattern in the refractions of their form. Revan did not address Taek directly. That too was protocol. Observers were not acknowledged unless their presence altered the flow of consensus, and the Keth took pride in ignoring distractions. Taek had expected that. What surprised him was how much the process reminded him of human committees, stripped of theatrics and compressed into something almost brutally honest. Arguments manifested as shifts in light intensity and pattern density. A Keth individual would introduce a conceptual structure encoded as a geometric progression, which others would then probe by intersecting it with counterstructures. Weaknesses showed themselves as distortions, areas where the light scattered unpredictably. Strong ideas held coherence even under multiple intersections. Time was not wasted on politeness. Ideas that failed were allowed to collapse without ceremony. The subject under consideration was humanity's request for expanded access to the compact archives beyond the initial offer. Specifically, humans had asked to review records of first contact failures, not merely wars. Taek had not expected this to be controversial. He was wrong. A cluster of Keth individuals radiated patterns the translation corps flagged as caution. These records were not merely historical. They were instructional scars, lessons learned at costs still felt in cultural memory. To share them with an external species was to risk repetition. Another cluster countered with a pattern of inevitability. Humanity was already present. Ignorance would not protect either side. As the debate unfolded, Taek found himself thinking of the human habit of storytelling. Humans preserved failure in narrative form, retelling disasters until they became cautionary myths. It was messy and subjective, but it allowed emotional weight to travel alongside facts. The Keth approach was cleaner, but perhaps too clean. Their records were precise to the point of abstraction. A failed contact was reduced to variables and outcomes, the pain implied rather than stated. Hours passed. Taek's legs began to ache, but he did not move. He had learned that small discomforts were insignificant compared to the value of being present. Eventually, consensus emerged as a gradual alignment of light, a slow settling into coherence. Access would be granted, but mediated. Human observers would be paired with Keth interpreters to ensure contextual understanding. When the chamber emptied, Revan finally addressed Taek. "You witnessed disagreement without hostility," Revan said. "Does this align with your expectations?" "It aligns with our aspirations," Taek replied. "We often fail to achieve it." Revan's facets shifted. "You fail often," they said, not unkindly. "Yes," Taek agreed, "but we survive our failures more often than we expect. That is why we want to study yours." Revan considered this, then extended an appendage that resolved into a narrow beam of light. It brushed against Tayek's forearm, a gesture that carried layered meaning, acknowledgement, warning, and a tentative form of respect. Survival is not the same as wisdom, Hrevan said. No, Tayek said, but it gives you more chances to learn it. The first archive session took place in a construct that felt less like a room and more like an idea given boundaries. Data flowed through Tayek's implants in carefully paced streams. He saw simulations of encounters with species whose sensory modalities humanity could barely imagine, species that communicated through gravitational fluctuations or quantum entanglement. Many of these encounters had failed not because of malice, but because of mismatched assumptions. One species had interpreted a greeting signal as a declaration of dominance and responded with overwhelming force. Another had perceived the compact's careful delays as indifference and escalated in desperation. Tayek took notes, not just on the events, but on the underlying patterns. Again and again, the failures traced back to an inability to adapt initial models when confronted with contradictory data. Pride played a role, but so did fear. Species clung to what they knew because letting go felt like erasure. As days passed, the human presence in the system normalized. Supply shuttles moved between Resolute of Clay and designated stations. Joint research teams began preliminary studies of Keth materials science and biology. The Keth, for their part, observed human social dynamics with fascination. They noted the casual hierarchy aboard the human ship, the way authority shifted fluidly depending on context. A junior engineer could contradict a mission commander if the data supported it, and the contradiction would be evaluated rather than punished. This flexibility unsettled some Keth analysts. Order, in their experience, required stable roles. Humanity seemed to thrive on controlled disorder. The Watchers updated their models again. Not all reactions within the compact were positive. In a peripheral cluster of systems, a faction known internally as the Preservation Accord began to mobilize opposition. They argued that humanity's adaptability was precisely the danger. A species that could reshape itself so readily would eventually destabilize any equilibrium. Better to impose limits now than regret leniency later. The Accord's influence was subtle but persistent. They seeded arguments into consensus streams, framing humanity as an uncontrolled variable. They cited simulations showing long-term cultural erosion following contact with highly adaptive species. They did not advocate war, but they pushed for containment measures that would effectively halt human expansion near compact space. Tayek became aware of this opposition not through official channels, but through a Keth analyst named Serat of Many Reflections, who requested a private exchange. Serat's form was less symmetrical than Hrevan's, facets constantly reconfiguring in ways that suggested a mind comfortable with uncertainty. "You should know," Serat said, "that there are those who believe your presence is an error we have not yet corrected." Tayek nodded. "We have people like that too," he said. "They usually call themselves realists. Do your realists often prevail?" Serat asked. "Sometimes," Tayek said, "usually after something goes wrong." Serat's light dimmed slightly. "We prefer to prevent wrongness rather than learn from it." "That is understandable," Tayek said, "but prevention requires accurate prediction, and prediction requires admitting when you do not know." Serat regarded him for a long moment. "You suggest that uncertainty should be embraced. I suggest it should be acknowledged," Tayek said. "There is a difference." The conversation did not resolve anything, but it established a channel. Serat began sharing anonymized excerpts from Preservation Accord arguments, and Tayek forwarded them to human analysts. Humanity had learned to take internal dissent seriously. Some of their worst disasters had come from ignoring inconvenient voices. Meanwhile, on the fringes of the system, an incident occurred that would test the fragile trust forming between humanity and the compact. A human survey vessel, the Nominal Horizon, detected an anomalous energy signature near a debris field believed to be inert. The signature matched no known natural phenomenon. Acting according to protocol, the vessel approached cautiously and deployed drones. What the drones found was a dormant Keth relic, an ancient construct predating the compact itself. Its activation triggered automated defenses that disabled the nominal Horizon's propulsion systems. The human crew sent a distress signal, which was picked up by both human and Keth monitoring arrays. The Preservation Accord seized on the incident as proof of human recklessness. They argued that unauthorized interaction with relics demonstrated a lack of respect for Keth heritage. Immediate sanctions were proposed. Other factions countered that the relic's presence had not been communicated and that the human response had been measured. Taek was summoned to address a multi-chamber consensus, a rare escalation. He stood once more in a space alive with light and argument, acutely aware that his words would ripple far beyond his own intentions. "We encountered something we did not recognize," he said, his voice steady. "We approached it cautiously. When it reacted, we withdrew as much as we were able and asked for help. That is not recklessness. That is curiosity constrained by protocol." "Your protocol is your own," came a reply from a preservation-aligned cluster. "It does not account for the sanctity of our past." Taek inclined his head. "Our pasts are full of sanctity," he said. "We have learned that sanctity unexamined becomes dogma, and dogma becomes a barrier to survival. We did not seek to violate your history. We stumbled into it. There is a difference." The debate intensified. Data from the nominal Horizon was reviewed. Human logs showed adherence to safety margins that exceeded minimum requirements. The relic's defenses were shown to have activated at a distance that would have endangered any vessel, human or otherwise. Slowly, the narrative shifted from blame to shared risk. In the end, consensus formed around a joint recovery effort. Keth specialists would assist in disabling the relic's defenses, and human engineers would help repair the nominal Horizon. The Preservation Accord registered dissent, but did not block the decision. The recovery operation became a symbol of the evolving relationship. Humans and Keth worked side by side, their differing approaches complementing each other. Keth precision guided human improvisation, while human redundancy compensated for Keth specialization. The relic was secured, its systems mapped without further activation. The nominal Horizon was towed to safety. In the aftermath, Taek stood on an observation deck with Hrevan and Serat, watching the distant glow of the operation. "This could have gone badly," Serat said. "It still might," Taek replied. "Trust is not a switch. It is a structure you build knowing it will need repairs." Hrevan's facets shimmered. "Your species treats risk as a material," they said. "You shape it rather than avoid it." "We try," Taek said. "Avoidance only works until it doesn't." The Watchers updated their records again, adding a new annotation to humanity's profile. Not merely stubborn adaptability, but collaborative resilience. It was an emergent property, one that could not be reduced to a single behavior. It manifested under stress, when models failed and choices mattered. Deep within the compact, the Preservation Accord recalibrated its strategy. Open opposition had failed to halt human integration. Subtler measures would be required. Cultural influence, regulatory complexity, the slow tightening of acceptable variance. These tools had worked before. Unaware of these undercurrents, most humans in the system focused on the tangible progress around them. Shared research produced breakthroughs in energy efficiency. Keth materials improved human hull designs. Human life support innovations intrigued Keth biologists. Each success reinforced the perception that cooperation was not merely possible, but beneficial. Taek, however, remained cautious. He had seen too many alliances fracture under the weight of unspoken fears. Late in the ship's artificial night cycle, he recorded a private log, reflecting on the delicate balance forming around them. He spoke of light and facets, of equations and scars, of a compact that feared change, and a humanity that sometimes rushed toward it without looking back. "We are being measured," he concluded, "not just by their watchers, but by ourselves. The question is not whether we belong here. It is whether we can grow without breaking what we touch. As he ended the log, the stars outside the viewport burned with indifferent clarity. Somewhere within that vastness, lines were being redrawn, not with force, but with understanding hard-won. Chapter by chapter, encounter by encounter, the measure of unbroken things was being tested. The weeks following the recovery of the nominal horizon settled into a rhythm that felt, to Tayek Solman, dangerously like comfort. Schedules aligned, shared workspaces expanded, and the constant low-level tension that accompanied first contact dulled into something backgrounded, like the hum of life support that no one noticed until it failed. Humanity had learned to be wary of such moments. Comfort bred assumptions, and assumptions were where fractures began. The compact, formalized joint operations protocols, dense frameworks of conditional permissions and escalation paths that attempted to account for as many contingencies as possible. Human legal analysts joked privately that the documents read like a civilization trying to litigate the future into compliance. Still, they signed, annotated, and complied. Humanity understood bureaucracy as another kind of terrain to be navigated, no less real than vacuum or radiation. Tayek's role shifted subtly during this period. He was no longer merely an envoy or observer. He became, by default, a translator of intent. When misunderstandings arose, both sides began routing them through him, trusting his ability to frame human behavior in terms the Keth could accept, and Keth concerns in ways humans could respect. It was a precarious position. Every translation risked distortion, and Tayek was acutely aware that he carried more influence than his title suggested. One such misunderstanding arose over habitat construction. A human consortium proposed deploying a series of modular habitats in a resource-sparse region near the system's outer belt. The structures would be temporary, designed to support mining operations before being dismantled and removed. To humans, this was minimal impact development. To the Keth Preservation Accord, it looked like the first step in a familiar pattern of creeping permanence. The objection was not filed as a veto, but as a request for extended review, invoking clauses that allowed for indefinite delay pending further study. Serat of Many Reflections brought the issue to Tayek with an unusual sharpness in their light. "This is containment," Serat said, "not caution." "They intend to exhaust you," Tayek sighed. "They might be trying to exhaust themselves too," he said. "Consensus takes energy, not when delay is the goal," Serat replied. "They fear that if you establish even temporary structures, precedent will follow." Tayek reviewed the Preservation Accord's arguments carefully. They were not irrational. They drew on historical cases where temporary settlements became permanent through inertia rather than intent. Humans had their own versions of that story. He convened a human working group and asked a question that unsettled them. What if we are wrong about how temporary we are willing to be? The answer, after uncomfortable debate, was that humans were very bad at leaving places that worked. Adaptability cut both ways. They could move on when forced, but if something functioned, they tended to build around it. Acknowledging that truth became the foundation of Tayek's response. When he addressed the compact chambers, he did not argue the technical merits of modular design. Instead, he spoke of human psychology. "We tell ourselves that nothing is permanent," he said. "That belief allows us to go places others might avoid. But belief is not behavior. If we find stability, we are tempted to root ourselves there, even when we promise not to." This admission rippled through the chambers, generating patterns the translation corps flagged as surprise. Few species volunteered their own flaws so openly in negotiation. It was a risk, but Tayek judged it necessary. "So we propose a constraint," he continued, "not imposed by you but by us. A structural limitation encoded into the habitats themselves. After a defined operational window, they will degrade beyond safe use unless actively dismantled. No refurbishment, no extension. If we want to stay, we will have to come back to you and ask again." Their idea sparked intense debate. The Preservation Accord objected that self-imposed limits were unenforceable. Others countered that designing fragility into infrastructure was a level of foresight rarely seen. Serrat supported the proposal, reframing it as an experiment in trust under controlled conditions. Consensus, when it came, was narrow but sufficient. The habitats would be allowed, with Keth observers embedded in the design and deployment process. The observers would verify that the degradation mechanisms were genuine and irreversible. Human engineers grumbled but complied. They understood the value of proving intent through material choices. As construction began, Keth observers watched humans deliberately build structures that would fail on schedule, embedding time as a physical constraint. It unsettled them. Keth architecture prized endurance. To build something meant to decay felt almost sacrilegious. The habitats functioned flawlessly for their intended lifespan. Mining operations proceeded efficiently, and data flowed back to both human and Keth analysts. When the degradation threshold approached, alarms sounded exactly as designed. True to their word, humans dismantled the structures, salvaging what they could and abandoning the rest to controlled collapse. The observers recorded every step. This success shifted internal compact models in subtle ways. Humanity had demonstrated not just adaptability, but restraint, a willingness to bind itself to future inconvenience to alleviate present fear. It did not silence the Preservation Accord, but it blunted their sharpest arguments. Elsewhere, deeper tensions brewed. In the shared research facilities orbiting Keth Prime, a human biologist named Arjun Patel and a Keth materials specialist known as Lethrin of Curved Light made a discovery that neither side had anticipated. Studying the relic recovered near the nominal horizon, they identified a dormant substructure capable of manipulating spacetime gradients on a local scale. Not a weapon, but a tool, possibly used for construction or transport in an era predating the compact. The implications were enormous. Such technology could revolutionize travel, energy distribution, and habitat stability. It could also destabilize every existing power balance. Protocol required immediate notification of the compact oversight councils. Humanity complied, but concern spread rapidly through both communities. The Preservation Accord reacted with alarm. Ancient technology was, in their philosophy, a closed chapter. It belonged to a past defined by excess and collapse. To resurrect it was to invite repetition. They pushed for the relic to be sealed permanently, its data classified and access restricted. Human leadership was divided. Some argued that knowledge, once glimpsed, could not be unlearned, and that suppressing it would only drive future discovery underground. Others cautioned that pushing too hard would confirm every fear the Accord held. Tayek found himself at the center again, mediating not just between species, but within his own. He requested a direct exchange with the Accord's primary spokesperson, a Keth elder whose designation translated loosely as Valith, Keeper of Boundaries. Valith's form was massive, facets broad and slow-moving, radiating a gravity that even the translation corps struggled to convey. "You seek what we buried for a reason," Valith said. "Do you believe yourselves exempt from history?" "No," Tayek said. "We believe ourselves shaped by it, which is why we want to understand yours." Valith's light darkened. "Understanding does not require use." "True," Tayek said, "but neither does ignorance guarantee safety. You buried this technology because it hurt you. We bury our own failures too. Sometimes that is wise. Sometimes it means the same mistake waits for the next generation, unexamined." Valith regarded him in silence that felt weighted rather than empty. "You would risk repeating our collapse to satisfy your curiosity." Tayek shook his head. "We would risk repeating it by pretending we are immune. If this technology exists, someone will eventually rediscover it. Better that it happens in the open, with caution and shared oversight, than in secret." The argument stretched over multiple sessions. Valith represented a deep current of compact identity, one forged in survival through limitation. Tayek represented a species that had survived by expansion and adaptation. Neither was wrong, but their priorities diverged. A compromise emerged slowly. The relic's technology would be studied further, but not applied, within a strictly controlled framework. A joint council, evenly balanced between human and Keth representatives, would oversee all research. Any proposal for practical use would require supermajority approval from both sides. It was an imperfect solution. Both sides accepted it because the alternative was fracture. As research continued, subtle effects began to manifest among the human crews. Exposure to Keth consensus processes and long-horizon thinking altered decision-making patterns. Humans accustomed to rapid iteration found themselves slowing down, considering broader implications. Some welcomed the change. Others chafed at it, fearing loss of momentum. Similarly, Keth researchers exposed to human improvisational methods began experimenting with controlled variants, allowing small deviations in models to explore unexpected outcomes. Results were mixed, but the process itself was transformative. The watchers noted these cross-cultural adaptations with interest. Two systems were influencing each other in ways no simulation had predicted. The Preservation Accord responded by intensifying cultural messaging within Keth society, emphasizing tradition and boundary maintenance. Art installations, educational narratives, and ritual commemorations highlighted the costs of past overreach. It was not overt propaganda, but it shaped perception. Humans were increasingly framed as a catalyst, a force that accelerated change whether intended or not. Tayek sensed the shift and worried. He had seen similar patterns in human history, where fear of external influence hardened into reactionary movements. He requested permission to address a broader Keth audience, not within a consensus chamber, but in a public forum. The request itself sparked debate. Public discourse was not the primary mode of compact decision-making. Eventually, permission was granted for a limited broadcast. Tayek stood in a chamber whose walls projected his image across multiple civic spaces. He felt exposed in a way he had not since his first off-world assignment. "I am not here to tell you who to be," he began. "Nor to argue that change is always good. Change has hurt us as often as it has helped, but stagnation has never saved us. Every boundary you maintain was once crossed by someone brave or foolish enough to test it. The question is not whether boundaries should exist. It is who gets to redraw them and why." He spoke of human worlds lost to environmental collapse, of technologies rushed into use without understanding consequences. He did not glorify human resilience. He described its costs. He framed adaptability not as virtue, but as necessity born from repeated failure. "I do not ask you to trust us blindly," he concluded. "I ask you to watch us closely, to challenge us, and to let us be changed by you as much as we change you. If we cannot do that, then we do not deserve a place among you." The response was muted, difficult to interpret. Some Keth patterns brightened, others dimmed. The Preservation Accord did not issue a direct rebuttal, which worried Tayek more than open opposition would have. Days later, Serat approached him with concern. "There is movement within the Accord," Serat said, "not toward violence, but toward withdrawal. They seek to isolate entire clusters rather than confront you directly." "Isolation can be a kind of violence," Tayek said. "Yes," Serat agreed, "but one that is difficult to oppose without appearing aggressive." Human leadership debated responses. Forcing engagement would validate fears. Accepting isolation risked creating hardened divisions. In the end, they chose a third path. Humanity would reduce its visible footprint voluntarily, consolidating operations and scaling back joint initiatives, while maintaining open channels for those who wished to engage. It was a strategic retreat, one that cost political capital among more expansion-minded human factions. Tayek supported it reluctantly. Sometimes, he knew survival meant knowing when not to push. The Watchers recorded the shift, noting that humanity was capable of contraction as well as expansion. This too was adaptability, though of a quieter sort. As Chapter 3 of this unfolding encounter drew to a close, the system existed in a state of uneasy equilibrium. Trust had deepened in places and eroded in others. Lines were less rigid but more visible. Ancient technology slept under watchful eyes, and temporary habitats had proven their impermanence. Taek stood alone on the command deck once more, watching Keth Prime rotate slowly below. He felt the weight of choices made and deferred. Humanity had not broken the compact, nor had it been absorbed by it. They existed now in the space between, a place humanity knew well and feared deeply. The measure of unbroken things was not static. It shifted with every compromise, every restraint, every risk taken or avoided. And somewhere within that shifting measure, the future waited, patient and unyielding, to see what would fracture next. Equilibrium, Taek Solman knew, was never a resting state. It was a tension held, a balance maintained by constant adjustment. The quieter the system became on the surface, the more he suspected strain beneath it. The reduction of humanity's visible footprint had slowed overt conflict, but it had also created pockets of ambiguity where intention could be misread. History, human and Keth alike, was full of disasters born not from action, but from misinterpreted restraint. The first indication that equilibrium was fracturing came not from diplomacy or politics, but from infrastructure. A Keth transit lattice node in the mid-system failed without warning, not catastrophically, but subtly. Traffic rerouted, delays compounded, and within hours resource distribution schedules began to drift out of alignment. For the compact, whose civilization was built on precise, predictable flows, this was alarming. Initial diagnostics suggested material fatigue inconsistent with known degradation models. The node was old, but not that old. Human analysts, reviewing shared data, noticed something else. The failure pattern resembled stress responses they had seen in human megastructures subjected to oscillatory loads. Not damage from use, but from resonance. Something had pushed the lattice at exactly the wrong frequencies, over time, amplifying micro stresses into macro failure. No weapon signature was detected. No external force was obvious. The Preservation Accord moved quickly to frame the incident as evidence of destabilization caused by proximity to human activity. Their argument did not claim intent, only correlation. Humans altered traffic patterns, introduced variants, and the system failed. The implication was clear: even passive human presence was a systemic risk. Taek pushed back internally, cautioning against immediate conclusions. Correlation without causation had destroyed more trust than malice ever had. He requested access to deeper diagnostic layers of the lattice node, including historical resonance data predating human arrival. Access was granted, but reluctantly. What the data revealed was deeply uncomfortable for everyone involved. The resonance patterns predated humanity by centuries. The lattice had been operating near a critical threshold for generations, its margins eroded by incremental changes no one had wanted to address, because addressing them would have required massive systemic disruption. The compact had optimized for stability so long that it had lost tolerance for recalibration. Humanity had not caused the failure. It had merely arrived in time to be blamed for it. Taek presented the findings to a joint council. He did so carefully, emphasizing shared responsibility rather than fault. This system was brittle before we arrived, he said, not because of neglect, but because of success. You built something so well that it became difficult to change. Valith, keeper of boundaries, responded with restrained intensity. You suggest that our stability is weakness. I suggest that stability without adaptation accumulates hidden debt, Taek replied. We know this because we have paid it repeatedly. The Preservation Accord resisted this framing fiercely. To accept it would mean confronting the possibility that their own philosophies had sown the seeds of future collapse. Instead, they proposed isolating affected lattice segments, reducing throughput, and enforcing stricter operational parameters. It was a familiar solution: limit interaction, limit risk. Human engineers reviewed the proposal and quietly panicked. The lattice was too interconnected. Isolation would redistribute stress unevenly, accelerating failures elsewhere. Humanity had seen similar cascade events in early interplanetary infrastructure. Limiting flow did not remove stress. It redirected it, often invisibly. Tayek requested permission for a demonstration. Using a scaled simulation environment shared between human and Keth systems, human engineers modeled the proposed isolation measures. They did not exaggerate. They used conservative assumptions, erred on the side of optimism. Even so, the results were clear. Within projected timeframes, secondary failures multiplied, eventually exceeding the original damage. The simulation did not speak in rhetoric. It spoke in collapse curves and failure trees. Silence followed, not the poetic absence of sound, but the dense cognitive pause of a civilization processing unwelcome truth. Valith's facets slowed. "If we accept your model," they said, "then our methods of preservation are accelerating decay." "Yes," Tayek said, "and ours have done the same in different ways. The difference is that we learn to look for it." "What do you propose?" Valith asked, and the question carried more weight than any demand. "Recalibration," Tayek said, "not replacement, not overhaul, incremental adjustment across the lattice, introducing controlled variants to bleed off resonance. It will be disruptive, there will be inefficiencies, but it will restore tolerance." The preservation accord reacted sharply. Disruption was anathema. Inefficiency was failure by another name. They argued that such measures would undermine social confidence, destabilize dependent systems, and create uncertainty across compact space. Tayek listened, then spoke a sentence that would be replayed in compact archives for generations. "Uncertainty is already here," he said. "You have simply been calling it order." The debate that followed was the most intense since humanity's arrival. Consensus chambers fractured into overlapping deliberations. Historical precedents were dragged into light, re-examined under new assumptions. Younger Keth factions, less scarred by the ancient wars, leaned toward recalibration. Older factions, shaped by survival through rigidity, resisted. Humanity did not push. They provided data, simulations, and case studies from their own failures and recoveries. They offered engineers and logistical support. They did not threaten withdrawal or escalation. They waited. The Watchers, observing the turbulence, adjusted their predictive frameworks beyond prior limits. Their original function had been to detect external threats. Now they found themselves monitoring internal systemic risk amplified by contact. Humanity was not an invader. It was a perturbation, revealing stresses long hidden. Consensus finally emerged, not as a decisive victory, but as a reluctant concession. A pilot recalibration would be attempted on a limited lattice segment with full joint oversight. If it failed, the preservation accord would be vindicated. If it succeeded, the compact would face uncomfortable questions about its own foundations. The recalibration was a feat of cooperation. Keth precision mapping combined with human redundancy planning. Where Keth models sought perfect adjustment, humans insisted on margin for error. Where humans proposed rapid iteration, Keth slowed the process, insisting on layered verification. The work was slow, meticulous, and deeply stressful. Systems were taken offline temporarily, traffic rerouted through less efficient paths, resource flows stuttered, public confidence wavered. Then, gradually, the resonance dampened. Stress indicators fell within safe bounds, micro-fractures stabilized. The lattice segment regained flexibility, its tolerance widened. It was not stronger in the sense the Keth traditionally valued, but it was more forgiving. The pilot was declared a success. The preservation accord did not dissolve, but its influence shifted. Their arguments evolved from absolute resistance to cautious participation. They reframed their role as guardians of pacing rather than immobility. It was not capitulation, but it was change. For Tayek, the victory felt hollow and heavy. He had seen enough of human history to know that success bred overconfidence. He worried that humanity would now be seen as indispensable, a dangerous pedestal to stand on. Those fears were not unfounded. Requests for human consultation increased. Compact systems struggling with aging infrastructure sought human input. Keth researchers asked for access to human historical datasets beyond what had been agreed. Humanity began to feel stretched, their limited presence pulled in too many directions. Internal human debates flared. Some argued that this was humanity's moment to lead, to shape the compact into something more resilient. Others warned that becoming a central pillar would entangle humanity in every future failure. Tayek aligned with the latter, but his influence was waning. Results spoke louder than caution. The ancient relic technology, still under joint study, added another layer of pressure. New insights suggested it could be used to actively manage resonance at scales previously impossible, not to eliminate it, but to redistribute it dynamically. The temptation to apply it grew stronger with each infrastructure challenge. Valith requested another private exchange. "You have shown us that we misnamed our fear," Valith said. "It is not change we fear, but loss of control." Tayek nodded. "Control is a comforting illusion. We cling to it when we cannot predict." "You live without it," Valith said. "We live with less of it," Tayek replied, "and we pay for that every day." Valith's facets glimmered. "If we apply this technology under your methods, will we become like you?" The question was not accusatory, it was vulnerable. "No," Tayek said, "you will become yourselves, but adapted." "We did not choose to be this way. We were shaped by necessity. You still have choices." Valith considered this. "And if we choose wrongly," Tayek's voice softened, "then you will survive it or you won't. That has always been the truth for all of us." The application of relic technology was postponed again, not rejected but deferred. The compact needed time to absorb the implications of what they had already accepted. Humanity, for once, did not push for acceleration. They had learned that forcing adaptation often broke what they hoped to strengthen. As recalibration expanded cautiously across the lattice, the system entered a new phase, not equilibrium, but managed instability. Feedback loops were acknowledged rather than suppressed. Variance was monitored rather than eliminated. The watchers updated their core directives. Observation alone was insufficient. They began to model intervention thresholds, not to enforce outcomes, but to highlight when inaction posed greater risk than change. It was a subtle shift, but a profound one. For the first time since their creation, the Watchers contemplated the possibility that their role was not to preserve the compact as it was, but to help it remain unbroken through transformation. Tayek sensed that humanity's presence had crossed an invisible threshold. They were no longer merely guests. They were participants in the compact's future, whether they wished to be or not. In a private message to human leadership, Tayek summarized his concerns. "We are becoming a reference point," he wrote. "That is dangerous. We must resist being seen as a solution rather than a collaborator." The response was mixed. Political pressures back home demanded tangible returns on investment. Alliances had expectations. Withdrawal now would be seen as abandonment. The chapter closed with a realization that unsettled Tayek deeply. Humanity had entered compact space, seeking understanding and coexistence. In doing so, they had become a catalyst for systemic change. Whether that change would strengthen or fracture the compact was no longer solely in Keth's hands, nor, he feared, was it fully in humanity's control. The measure of unbroken things was shifting again, not through conflict, but through reliance. And reliance, history taught, was often the prelude to collapse if left unexamined. Reliance changed the texture of every conversation. Tayek Solman began to notice it in small ways first. Requests framed as questions, but carrying the weight of expectation. Data packets prefaced with language that assumed human analysis would provide clarity where Keth models diverged. Even silences shifted, lingering a fraction longer, as if waiting for humanity to speak first. None of it was hostile. That was what made it dangerous. Humanity had not intended to become an axis. They had arrived as one variable among many, and now systems were bending around them. The recalibration of the transit lattice expanded outward in carefully staged phases. Each phase succeeded, but each success reinforced a narrative that worried Tayek deeply. When things broke, humans fixed them. When uncertainty rose, humans framed it. When models conflicted, human tolerance for ambiguity provided the bridge. The compact, long defined by internal coherence, was externalizing part of its adaptive capacity. That was not sustainable. Within the compact, younger Keth factions began to advocate openly for deeper integration. Not merely cooperation, but structural alignment. Shared councils, harmonized protocols, even proposals for mixed governance bodies. They framed it as resilience through diversity. Tayek heard echoes of human federations that had promised the same and fractured under pressure. At the same time, the Preservation Accord hardened its internal boundaries. Having failed to halt change directly, they turned inward, consolidating cultural identity and limiting participation in joint initiatives. Entire clusters withdrew from recalibration efforts, citing philosophical exemption. The compact began to show asymmetry, regions adapting at different rates, tolerances diverging. This too was familiar to Tayek. Uneven adaptation created stress gradients created failure points. The breaking point did not come from ideology or diplomacy, it came from physics. A recalibrated lattice segment intersected, indirectly, with an unrecalibrated one. The interface between adaptive and rigid structures produced unexpected resonance amplification, not enough to cause immediate failure, but enough to trigger cascading inefficiencies. Resource delays compounded. Emergency routing protocols activated more frequently. The system did not collapse, but it groaned. Analysts on both sides identified the problem within hours. Solutions, however, diverged sharply. Human engineers proposed extending recalibration universally, accelerating the process to eliminate mismatched interfaces. Keth preservationists argued for isolating recalibrated segments instead, preventing their influence from propagating. Both approaches carried risk. Acceleration threatened cultural destabilization. Isolation threatened systemic fracture. The joint councils deadlocked. For the first time since humanity's arrival, the Watchers issued an internal alert. Not a public warning, but a signal within their own processing layers that predictive confidence had dropped below acceptable thresholds. Too many variables were now coupled across species, culture, and infrastructure. Tayek was summoned again, this time not as an observer or translator, but as a participant in an emergency deliberation. The distinction mattered. Participation implied responsibility. You have helped us survive our own success, Valith, Keeper of Boundaries, said. Now your presence threatens to divide us. Tayek did not argue the premise. Division was already here, he said. We made it visible. And visibility does not heal, Valith replied. No, Tayek said, but concealment rots. The chamber's light patterns pulsed with tension. Other Keth voices joined, some supportive, others wary. Serat of many reflections projected a complex pattern that translated loosely as warning layered with regret. You are becoming indispensable, Serat said, and that is altering how we decide. Some defer to you, others define themselves in opposition to you. Both are distortions. Tayek felt the weight of that truth settle into his chest. He had spent his life navigating between systems, translating, adapting, surviving. He had never wanted to be central. Centrality was a trap. What happens if we leave? He asked quietly. The question rippled through the chamber like a shockwave. Valith's facets stilled. You would abandon processes you began, they said. Systems dependent on your models would destabilize. Yes, Tayek said, and if we stay, you risk shaping yourselves around us until you forget how to adapt without us. That destabilization would simply take longer. Silence followed, not absence, but processing at a depth few outsiders ever witnessed. Human leadership had considered withdrawal as a theoretical contingency, never as an immediate option. Now Tayek was placing it on the table as a moral necessity. "I am not proposing severance," he continued. "I am proposing decoupling, a deliberate reduction of reliance. We step back from central roles. You recalibrate on your own terms, at your own pace. We remain available, but not primary." "This would increase short-term risk," Valith said. "Yes," Tayek agreed, "but it reduces long-term dependency. You will own your adaptations, not borrow ours." The Preservation Accord, for once, did not immediately oppose the idea. Withdrawal aligned with their instincts, but the terms unsettled them. Humans stepping back voluntarily challenged their narrative of containment. Debate raged. Some accused humanity of abandoning responsibility. Others argued that this was the most responsible act possible. The Watchers fed probabilistic projections into the discourse, but even they struggled to quantify cultural self-efficacy. In parallel, humanity faced its own crisis. News of potential decoupling spread through human networks. Political factions polarized rapidly. Some saw it as betrayal of progress and opportunity. Others saw it as a necessary assertion of autonomy. Economic interests pushed back hard. The compact represented unprecedented access to technology and knowledge. Tayek found himself criticized from all sides, too cautious for expansionists, too invasive for isolationists. He bore it silently. He had learned long ago that clarity rarely felt good in the moment. The lattice interface problem worsened incrementally, not enough to force immediate action, but enough to make delay costly. A decision had to be made. The compact reached consensus first. In a resolution unprecedented in its history, the compact acknowledged external influence as a systemic factor requiring active management. They accepted humanity's proposal for phased decoupling. Joint operations would be restructured to ensure that Keth systems could function independently of human intervention. Human advisors would transition to training roles rather than operational ones. Recalibration methodologies would be transferred fully into Keth control, with humans stepping back from oversight. It was, in effect, a controlled withdrawal. Human leadership, after intense internal struggle, accepted the compact's terms, not unanimously. The decision fractured political coalitions and would have repercussions for decades. But it was made. The implementation was painful. Human engineers who had embedded themselves deeply in compact infrastructure were reassigned or recalled. Joint research projects were slowed or suspended. Advisory channels narrowed. Keth specialists took over systems they had learned alongside humans, now without the safety net of human redundancy. Mistakes happened. A recalibration phase was mistimed, causing localized disruptions. A Keth team, accustomed to human improvisational support, hesitated too long when a model diverged. A human crew, stepping back, resisted the urge to intervene even when they saw an error forming. The error resolved without catastrophe, but the lesson cut deep. Independence was uncomfortable. That discomfort was the point. Over time, the compact's internal dynamics began to shift again. Younger factions gained confidence, not from human validation, but from surviving missteps on their own. The Preservation Accord softened, reframing preservation as continuity through learning rather than stasis. Their rhetoric changed subtly, honoring adaptation that did not erase identity. Humanity, watching from a step removed, felt a complex mix of relief and loss. They had tasted influence and relinquished it. For a species accustomed to expanding until constrained, restraint felt like failure to some. To others, it felt like growth. Tayek prepared to depart Keth Prime. Resolute of Clay would remain in system for a time, but his role as central intermediary was ending. Others would take up narrower, less influential positions. Before leaving, he met Valith one last time. "You have done what few would," Valith said. "You stepped back from power." Tayek smiled faintly. Power is easiest to misuse when you think you earned it. Valith's facets glimmered. We will struggle without you. You would have struggled with us too, Taek said, just differently, and if we fail. Taek met the ancient being's gaze. Then you will rebuild, as you always have. Without us as an excuse, the farewell was not ceremonial. It did not need to be. Both understood the weight of what had passed between them. As Taek boarded the shuttle back to Resolute of Clay, he looked out at Keth Prime one last time. The planet was unchanged in its orbit, its light steady, and yet everything about it had shifted. Not because of humanity's presence alone, but because the compact had been forced to confront itself. The Watchers recorded the decoupling as a critical event. They adjusted their long-term projections, noting increased variance, but also increased resilience. Humanity's profile was updated again, now including a trait that defied simple categorization: voluntary diminishment. It was not a strategy the Watchers had modeled before. As Resolute of Clay drifted away from Keth Prime, humanity's future relationship with the compact remained uncertain. Trade would continue. Knowledge would flow more slowly, more deliberately. Trust, once so precarious, now rested on a different foundation: mutual recognition of limits. The measure of unbroken things, Taek reflected, was not how much you could hold together, but how much you could let go without shattering. Distance changed perspective, but it did not erase connection. As Resolute of Clay settled into a wide holding orbit beyond the densest traffic bands of Keth Prime, Taek Solman felt the peculiar weight that came only after a long, consuming effort ended without triumph or disaster. There were no celebrations waiting for him, no condemnations either. Just a quiet recalibration of purpose, both personal and collective. Humanity's decoupling from central compact processes rippled outward in subtle ways. Some joint projects quietly dissolved, their data archived and set aside for later generations to reinterpret. Others persisted in leaner forms, carried forward by individuals rather than institutions. The era of rapid integration was over. What followed was slower, more deliberate, and far less visible. That Taek suspected was the point. Back on human channels, the political aftershocks intensified. Entire blocks accused leadership of surrendering strategic advantage. Others praised the decision as the first truly mature act of interstellar policy humanity had ever taken. Editorials proliferated, each convinced it had identified the moment history would later mark as pivotal. Taek ignored most of it. He had learned that hindsight was a luxury history rarely afforded those living inside it. Instead, he focused on reports from compact space. The recalibration effort continued without human oversight, uneven but persistent. Some lattice segments failed and were rebuilt. Others stabilized into new operational norms that no longer sought perfect equilibrium, only survivable imbalance. The compact did not fracture. It bent, protested, and adapted in its own fashion. The Preservation Accord, once the loudest voice of resistance, transformed into something unexpected. With humans no longer serving as a focal adversary, their rhetoric softened. They turned inward, documenting traditions, reinforcing cultural continuity, and participating selectively in adaptation rather than opposing it outright. Without an external force to define themselves against, they were forced to confront their own rigidity. The Watchers, ever attentive, noted this shift with quiet fascination. Their early mandate had been to detect threats. Over time, it had evolved into something more complex, detecting fragility. Humanity's arrival had forced that evolution faster than any internal reform ever had. In one of the deepest Watcher archives, a long-term projection was updated and flagged as anomalous. The probability of compact survival over the next several millennia had increased, not because risk had decreased, but because response diversity had grown. The Watchers did not assign credit, they merely recorded correlation. Humanity, for its part, felt the absence keenly. Expansion fleets adjusted their trajectories away from compact borders. New exploration efforts targeted less politically dense regions. There was relief in that, but also disappointment. Keth Space had offered humanity something rare, a mirror not clouded by human assumptions. Tayek began mentoring a new cohort of envoys, individuals who would maintain limited but meaningful ties with the compact. He emphasized listening over persuasion, patience over initiative. Some of them struggled with that. Humanity's instinct was still to fix, to optimize, to improve. Learning when not to intervene proved harder than any technical challenge. During one such session, a younger envoy asked him whether the decoupling had been worth it. Tayek considered before answering. "Worth is the wrong measure," he said. "We avoided something worse." Sometimes that is the best outcome available. And if the compact declines anyway, the envoy pressed, then at least it will be their decline, Tayek said, not something shaped around our shadow. Months passed, then years. The compact sent fewer messages, but when they did, the tone had changed. They no longer asked what humanity thought should be done. They shared what they had done, what had worked, and what had failed. Occasionally, they asked for historical parallels, not prescriptions. Humanity responded in kind, offering stories rather than solutions. One message, carried through layers of translation and delay, reached Tayek long after he had stepped back from active duty. It came from Serat of Many Reflections. "We misjudged you," Serat wrote, "not in your capacity to change us, but in your willingness to stop doing so. That restraint has altered how we measure strength." Tayek read the message several times. He did not reply immediately. Some acknowledgments did not require symmetry. Far away, in regions of space humanity had not yet charted, other civilizations continued their own trajectories, unaware of the quiet precedent set in the Keth system. No grand alliance was forged, no doctrine codified. There would be no universal rule that said stepping back was always right. But the example existed now, embedded in archives and memories. The Watchers, reviewing long arcs of causality, adjusted one final internal parameter. They added a classification not for humanity alone, but for encounters like this one. They labeled it mutual non-dominance adaptation, a process by which civilizations survived contact without convergence or conquest. It was rare. It was inefficient. It was, according to every prior model, unstable. And yet it persisted. On his final day aboard Resolute of Clay, before transferring to a quieter assignment closer to human space, Tayek stood once more at the viewport. The ship's name reflected faintly in the glass, letters worn by time and use. Clay was still being shaped, he thought, not by force, but by pressure and patience. He recorded one last personal log, not for archives or policy review, but for himself. "We went looking for a place to exist," he said softly. "We found a limit instead, not a wall, but an edge where our influence stopped being helpful. Stepping back did not make us smaller. It reminded us that survival is not about filling every available space." He ended the log and watched the stars slide slowly past as the ship prepared to jump. Somewhere behind him, the compact continued its long, careful work of becoming something slightly different from what it had been. Somewhere ahead, humanity would repeat old mistakes and invent new ones, as it always had. The universe did not reward either path, it simply endured. And in that endurance, shaped by countless choices to hold on or let go, the measure of unbroken things continued to be written, not in conquest or harmony, but in the fragile, deliberate act of coexistence.